Checkerboard rendering has been the choice way for developers to increase the perceived resolution of games on PlayStation 4 Pro, and we at Digital Foundry have often been impressed. Due to the console exclusivity of many of these games, we've not had the chance usually to compare this technique with alternative resolutions or the real 4K. With a string of PlayStation exclusive titles coming to PC in the future, and assuredly more on the way, in this video we will be investigating the quality of checkerboard rendering, starting with Detroit Become Human from Quantic Dreams, which is releasing on Steam on June 18th of this year. So how does checkerboard rendering hold up? Well, on PlayStation 4 Pro, Detroit Become Human is running 4K with it being checkerboarded internally with a sparse 1920 by 2160, where each frame, this checkerboard pattern of pixels, is alternated and rendered, and the missing points in this checkerboarded pattern are filled in with pixels generated based upon information from previous frames. Along with checkerboarding, this game engine in Detroit was designed with very robust motion vectors, as they're called, which is information used to tell the direction and speed of pixels between frames. The game then uses these to reproject pixels from previous frames to make other effects running at a lower resolution look less grainy and instead kind of higher resolution. So things like screen space reflections, SSAO, depth of field, and even hair. So there's a lot of temporal reconstruction occurring in this game along with the checkerboard rendering. Particular to this game also is the fact that post-processing is done at the pre-checkerboarded resolution due to it being too expensive at native resolution on PlayStation 4 Pro. This is actually different than other games that use reconstruction, like Dark Souls Remastered on PlayStation 4 Pro or Gears of War 5 on Xbox One X, which utilize full resolution post-processing for effects like motion blur and depth of field. So the checkerboarded reconstruction in Detroit is rigorously integrated and plays well with the engine's heavy reliance on temporal AA, which is used to achieve this game's look. In 2018, it was right there up with its peers on the platform. Now with the PC version being available, how does it compare? Like I said, before checkerboarding resolved, the total amount of pixels in the internal image is a lot less than 4K, and it is similar to a resolution slightly higher than 1440p. In typical non-sparse rendering, that would be 2715 by 1527. Here I think an image comparison to this resolution is useful to see what checkerboarding brings to the table. And to do this, I set the game on PC to 2715 by 1527 without fidelity FX sharpening to keep things equal, and the game automatically scales this resolution to a 4K container with native resolution UI. The settings here are set to Ultra and the frame rate is capped to 60 on PC. But since we know that post-processing is done differently on PS4 Pro, I will not be comparing image quality artifacts produced by effects like SSR or depth of field, which would not be equal anyway, rather by texture clarity and geometric edge quality. Right away in the starting scenes of the game, it is rather simple to notice differences between the checkerboarded image and one with nearly the exact same amount of pixels, but uncheckerboarded. Here in the elevator, for example, as the camera shows Connor's back, if you look at his collar, which is this edge of white flush against his skin, it shows obvious aliasing or jaggies in the 1527p image. If you switch over to checkerboarded 4K, as you would see on the PS4 Pro, the edge is smoothed out and the alias that is present there is much, much smaller. There are quite literally more pixels in the end post-checkerboarding resolve that are reprojected into the full 4K grid of pixels. So there's new information brought about by 4K checkerboarding that is then anti-aliased. Similar differences can also be seen in the game's transparency textures, like those for hair. When you stop any one scene where characters are close to the camera, you can see how the checkerboard rendering on PS4 Pro resolves hair to have more detail, where individual strands become visible. With the equivalent non-checkerboarded resolution, the hair is more smoothed over, and individual strands start to disappear in many shots, as detail smaller than pixel size tends to get smoothed over a bit. A similar effect can be seen on textures as well that have very small features, like here in this scene. If you pay attention to the drapes here on PS4 Pro, you can see how that embroidered look on the drapes shows up in the texture. Switching over to 1527p, that texture pattern is reduced and texture detail is more smoothed over by the game's TAA. Textures in game that have an easily recognizable pattern, like text, for example, show this sub-pixel effect best. In this scene in the paint store, the text on the UI terminal at the desk here has a filtered look to it at 1527p. Since the text is hard-line, detail, and sub-pixel in size, TAA and the lower spatial resolution of 1527p smooths it out. It lacks aliasing, but the detail itself is compromised. With checkerboarded 4K, that hard-edged look of the text is actually much better preserved. This is the point of checkerboarding. It is preserving and reconstructing detail that an image of the same internal resolution that is not checkerboarded and reconstructed over time will miss or glaze over. It is bringing in detail that only a higher resolution can actually capture, and also giving edges where aliasing occurs more pixels, so aliasing can then be minimized. It works to approach the detail of an image of many more real pixels while being cheaper to render. Cheaper to render than 4K here, but also it would be more expensive to render than a standard image with the same amount of total pixels, like 1527p. That's the trade-off. So how does it fare against the real deal in 4K? Let's go back to the beginning of the game, but this time to where Connor is talking to Captain Allen. When looking at the computer on the desk, this straight tilted edge here with checkerboarding on PS4 Pro produces a pixel crawl and aliasing. The checkerboard resolve cannot turn the slanted straight line into an anti-aliased one. Native 4K in comparison has more or less a completely smooth over edge here, devoid of all aliasing next to the checkerboard presentation of that same edge. If we go over to other types of edges, we see similar behavior, like in hair for example. If you stop a frame of movement where hair is visible, like on this girl here, you can see how checkerboard 4K leaves such features detailed but aliased at the same time. Native 4K in comparison retains the detailed look, but aliased edges are more or less eliminated. So that extra detail that checkerboarding can generate is not always completely stable, as edges and movement may not fit well within the checkerboard pattern or be able to be perfectly reprojected across frames. And if there's nothing to reproject at all, you can see other artifacts occurring, like here in this scene as the camera cuts. Native 4K right after the camera cut is aliased since TAA cannot do much, but it still looks okay. Checkerboarding in comparison has brightly shaded holes in the hair after this frame cut, as there's no previous frame with information in it to reproject into the current frame. While this is an egregious example, this technically can happen for any smaller part of the image that does not play well with checkerboarding, like transparency on this visor of this police officer, which looks pixelated and kind of shows the checkerboarding in it if you look. But at native presentation, it is smooth and detailed. Beyond aliasing and edges, inner surface texture detail on opaque materials shows some interesting differences. Take here in the elevator as it opens up at native 4K, and we look behind Connor. Here there's this high frequency texture detail with variations in roughness, as well as a striated look to the structure of the metal. It's quite a lot of detail from far away. As we switch over to checkerboarding, we can see a smoothing over of that detail in comparison, where that striated look is lessened and the details that are pixel sized lose contrast. This is a general effect that actually occurs to the whole overall image with checkerboarding on in comparison to native 4K. The image looks less sharp on inner surface detail even when not zooming in, so it looks softer. There's just a lessened contrast to this image. With details like text, that effective difference can become most obvious. With checkerboarding, that UI text near the desk looked better than that found in the 1527p image. But with the 4K native image, such stark, hard-edged lines like those found on the text here are rendered more accurately. So like DLSS 2.0 that I saw in Control, hard-edged lines like those found in text or graphic art do not play perfectly well with reconstruction always. This is not just limited to graphic art or text, but can be found on straight-edged geometry as well, like here as the bus drives by as well in this scene. If you look at this building in the distance at native 4K, we can see how the window frame and struts making it up have a high contrast as their specular shine in the sunlight defines their look. In spite of that brightness and contrast, they're relatively well anti-aliased straight lines due to the game's TAA. With checkerboarding, these straight-lined high-contrast details are swallowed by the resolve actually. If they're not entirely missing, then the contrast has been reduced to the point where the window actually takes on a slightly different look altogether. In comparison to native 4K, I would say checkerboarding does not produce the same level of detail and can have some artifacts and aliasing that the real image would not have. But how does it look next to intermediate resolutions above 1527p but lower than 4K, like 1800p? There's a much greater similarity in overall sharpness and inner surface detail between the checkerboarded 4K of the PS4 Pro and 1800p. If you look at the edge aliasing for opaque edges, you'll see a similar look there as well. Only with transparency textures like hair does aliasing look decidedly different, where 1800p can look less aliased, but perhaps less detailed. Text, though, once again shows an advantage for a non-checkerboarded resolution, where 1800p more crisply resolves the text in the paint shop. So checkerboard 4K will be trading blows with 1800p. With that comparison, I think we could come to some general conclusions about checkerboarding as it is here in Detroit. Checkerboarded 4K as a sum looks much better than its constituent real resolution. It adds in more detail, anti-aliases edges better, and actually generates new information into a 4K pixel grid, which upscaling just cannot ever do. It would of course be more expensive than 1527p resolution, but still the technique proves itself and that point stands. In comparison to 4K, it generally looks softer and can have more aliasing on opaque edges. It can also over-average away detail. Given that total difference, I would surmise it's not a real facsimile of 4K, but an alternative to mid-resolutions like 1800p where it looks more similar. Next to 1800p, checkerboarding would also actually have a performance advantage, as although checkerboarded resolve has a computational cost of its own, it will be less heavy on memory bandwidth while also producing visually similar results. This lessened memory bandwidth due to a lower internal resolution is a great advantage for any platform, especially a platform like the PS4 Pro, which has a more constrained bandwidth relative to its compute power. And honestly, I would love to have such an option on PC in this game, as even on the mightiest of GPUs with the RTX 2080 Ti at 4K and ultra settings, there are scenes with a lot of vegetation like here in this park where really the GPU looks to be bandwidth bound, something which can even rear its head at 1800p. It's just that this game's highest settings, without checkerboarding or without reducing the resolution of post effects, is heavy and has a large bandwidth requirement. In such a scenario, I would happily trade a bit of clarity to free up the GPU to push effects and frame rate with something like checkerboarding. But anyway, that is enough from me for now. If you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help Digital Foundry out, please consider supporting us on Patreon to get years worth of our content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about checkerboarded 4K and how it compares to other resolutions, write a comment below and follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.